going to start because I have no mercy and because it's a short hour and I have a ridiculous amount to say about this thing, and I hope you'll have a ridiculous amount to say too. I'm Tom Bruce. I build things. Often they break. Sitting in the back of the room trying to hide is Brian Hughes, who built many of the things that you'll see today. His don't often break. And what I'm here to tell you about is the so-called legal electronic or legal education document archive. We call it one or the other depending on which day of the week it is and whether or not we can get our story straight, which is really a number of things. It's a kind of Swiss Army knife that has arisen out of some projects at Harvard and Cornell to answer some problems that I think a lot of you have or will have. And we think in many ways it's quite helpful. What the heck is it? Well, it's a web publishing system, a self-service web publishing system that allows faculty or their representatives or really anyone else in the world to drop an RTF document onto a website and have good things happen with it, and what good things we'll see in a minute. It is a resource location tool because in the process of doing that dropping, we collect a bunch of things from the submitters that help in finding the data later. It's an electronic archive of legal scholarship, assuming that legal scholarship is what you put in it. But that sounds so much nicer than saying, oh, it's a big bucket, which I also say a lot. It's a substrate or a basis on which all kinds of value-added services can be developed, because once you have all that metadata, once you have all that bibliographic data sitting in a big bucket or a collection of big buckets in a known location, there are lots of things that you can do with it. It's a federated digital ePrint library based on the Open Archives Initiative standard. That's a lot of gobbledygook, but we'll see what that means a little bit later on. Suffice it to say for the moment that not only is it a big bucket, but there are ways to get all the buckets to talk to each other. It's also a software development project that uses open source tools and techniques to try to build this thing. To the extent that there is proprietary software in this, it's freeware. It's all stuff that is well understood in the open source community and the law school community. It's, we tried to make it as easy as possible for people to customize this thing and to contribute to it in any way they see fit. Another way to put that is to say that I wanted there to be a very good chance that if someone came to me and said, well, Tom, why doesn't it do this? I could look at them and say, well, why don't you build it? And have some reasonable chance that, in fact, they would. Today, we're going to take sort of three quick looks at it, a sort of user's view for a user who might be an author who wants to submit something, a site maintainer who's running one of these repositories, or a researcher who's trying to find something in one. Sort of technical view, which is the walkthrough for geeks. How does this thing work? And what I'll call a social view taken throughout, which takes in various project strengths and weaknesses. I have to tell you at the outset, and I will tell you again about 4 times today, that at one and the same time I'm exhilarated by this thing and I'm terrified. I'm exhilarated by it because I think more than anything that I have seen since the web came along, it has the ability to do things in law schools that are in many ways transformative. I think our chances of bringing it off, as long as law schools remain a consumer culture for this kind of thing, are really kind of small, and that's the terrifying part. I'm worried that nobody else wants to play, or wants to play enough to do all the playing that it's going to take to get this thing to work. But we'll see about that. We'll see about that. I'm not so pessimistic as all that. I've just learned to be cautious. Let's look at the web publishing and resource location piece of this. What happens with this thing, and we'll actually see it happen in a minute, is that the user uploads a document that they've saved in RTF format out of their favorite kiddie word processor. System collects metadata from them in a closely tailored series of web forms that basically ask them for things they know about their document. What's the title? Who are you? When did you do this? What kind of a thing is it? In a way that's not much more complicated than ordering a shirt from Land's End or wherever one orders one's shirts. If you're Elmer, I'm not sure. After upload, the document is converted to HTML and PDF, sometimes well, sometimes badly. And the metadata is used, obviously collected and used to support all sorts of search and other services. Let's do a quick walkthrough of a submission. I'll give you the major high points sort of in advance. We tried very, very hard to form fit what you're about to see both to the document and to the user. We were thinking about online commerce and tax software like TurboTax when we did it, because we were trying to think of environments that were very forgiving of mistakes or confusion about what the user ought to be really doing at any particular moment. You know, it asks you for some relatively technical looking piece of information. Well, maybe you don't know what that is at the point where you fill in the form, but 2 screens further on you realize, oh hell, that should have been such and such and such and such. You need the ability to go back. You need to be able to work with this quite fluidly. In order to let inexperienced users work with it well. And I think we've done pretty well with that. We've got a good ability to backtrack, change your mind, fix errors, correct misunderstandings, or otherwise play around during the submission process. Let's look at one, assuming I can make this work better than the radio mouse was. The user begins with a series of contentious-looking instructions that hopefully they never have to look at more than once. Basically, all this tells them is you need an RTF file, and this will take about 15 minutes. Really, the beginning is here. It asks you what sort of a person you are. I'm going to be today a staff or student person working on behalf of a faculty member, and I have in my bag a paper that's going to be included in a working paper series or some other kind of collection. And I know the title, that much I know. I'm going to call it the CALI submission, which sounds suspiciously like a tale of sex slavery in the drug trade. And I'm going to give it my email address. And I'm going to give it a file. I'm going to give it an RTF file, in fact, assuming that I can find one. Oh, no, you guys must be kidding. Let's see. I still have my floppy in there? Okay. That's what's happening to me. Okay. You guys are so technical. I really like this. I have here a paper that I borrowed from Cynthia Farina. It's uploaded. It told me how big it was. If I had more pieces to this thing, if I had chapters 1 through 3 and 4 through 7 and 12 through 13 and 14 graphs and tables, I could continue to upload those for as long as I needed to get all of the parts there. I won't, because I have only one part today. And at the end of the time that I'd put all my bits and pieces there, I would see a nice list of them here instead of only one. And as you can see, it's inviting me to put these in sequence. This is number 1 of 1. And what sort of thing it is, generally speaking. Complete document, a title page, a preface, an introduction, blah, blah, blah. Having done that, it asks for author information. I'm going to do something rather incomplete here by way of demonstrating a feature. Turns out we have a few of Cynthia's things on this test server already, so I'm just going to put in a last name. And it comes back and it says, oh, well, I know about somebody like that already, based on a Soundex search. Do you want this new sort of stupid person that you put here, or do you want the one that you really had already? So that if you're John Smith and you put yourself in as John Smith and there are 20 John Smiths, it will ask you, in fact, which John Smith you are, if you are some new John Smith, and we will be the one John Smith. If I had more authors, just as if I had more parts, I could loop through this endlessly, happily adding authors as I go. There are, by the way, ways that you can preload authors to make self-submission easier for a fixed population of people, like faculty in your institution. I'm going to skip 90% of what's actually in this screen because I don't need it to do what I need to do, but as you can see, it's asking for significantly more metadata that it might actually need to describe this piece, whatever it is. We're not going to do that. What we are going to do is give it an abstract, which it does insist on having. But fear not, I've done a lot of these submissions for other people, and while faculty who don't publish in an interdisciplinary way generally don't do abstracts, I've found that 99% of the time it's possible to pull something out of the first few paragraphs that will do. It would be nicer if they prepared them. They often don't. I think the practice is becoming more prevalent. But it's not completely necessary. You can usually find something to do for it. Having done that, I said, okay, well, what kind of an animal is this? This is actually an administrative law paper with some human rights overtones, let's say. And so I can select multiple categories. This list of roughly 80 was done by distilling some existing stuff out of current index to legal periodicals, a thing that was done at Harvard a couple of years ago to categorize faculty writing. We took a lot, we mixed and blended, we chopped and channeled, we came out with about 80 that we thought were fully descriptive. The idea was to have something good without having something that was so elaborate that no one could use it. You know, the idea that users are going to self-submit with full Library of Congress subject heads is really kind of silly. So we thought we'd keep it easier for them than that. The basic idea was to come up with a set of descriptive categories that were good scopes for electronic search. Remember, we don't have to find any books on a shelf with this thing. We just have to give people a bag in which it's reasonable to rummage for some sort of title or other, and these struck us as being pretty good bags. In addition to that, we can add some keywords of our own devising. There's no control over this vocabulary at all, although I think we might ultimately decide that we wanted to look at it retrospectively and say, well, what keywords are people commonly using, and is that suggestive of other categories? But for now, we're completely free to put whatever we want there. So I'm going to use keyword 1 and a nice phrase like eminent domain, which I actually don't think has anything to do with this paper, but it looks all nice and legal. And finally, in the seventh step, I've given the opportunity to review and edit absolutely anything that I have done so far. I choose not to because I'm a very self-confident sort of a fellow. And I'm done. Actually, I'm not done because it's sitting there happily converting the thing. And what will happen here in a second is that we'll see a confirmation screen. A mail message has been fired off to me at the address I gave it on that very first screen saying, hey, you submitted this thing. It hasn't been approved yet. Wait a while. We'll tell you when it's up. Because what has happened at this point is that both the metadata and the documents themselves have gone into a kind of holding tank waiting for a person that we call a reviewer, largely because we didn't want to call him a cataloger, because we didn't want to make the catalogers nervous. Looks at this thing and says, well, this will go or this won't. And we'll look at that sort of quality control step in a second. The review system, I mean, the idea there was to have a reviewer, as I say, approve all the submissions before they go to the web. And let's just look at that right quick, and then I'll have something halfway intelligent to say about it. This is probably the least developed of the interfaces because we're actually waiting for more people than Deanna to work with it and tell us, you know, how broken it actually is and what they need. They get some stats, but they can go in and look by author. And if we look at Cynthia Farina, the CALI submission, this is the one we just did, we have the opportunity to review the data, and you can see that the metadata here is presented in a way that is a little more technical. It's a little more something that a technical services person would feel comfortable with. And we can look over all of that, and we can even, in fact, proof the papers themselves and the conversions and make changes to the metadata, save them, and ultimately approve the document. Let's actually just take a quick look at what it did. This is the original. Okay, I'm in Navigator. This is the HTML conversion from an RTF original. It's really pretty good. It handles footnotes rather well. You get forward and back references. Fonts and stuff are generally pretty nice, and we're gradually tuning all of the special character problems out of the conversion. I will have more to say about conversion issues later on because they are extremely hairy and extremely ugly and likely to make me old before my time in a very bad way. Now, looking at the PDF, that isn't too bad. It isn't too great. The footnotes are probably misnumbered, although they might not be. It turns out that there is no way, there is no commercial Adobe product to create PDF under Linux. other than a $15,000 enterprise document conversion server, which I didn't have it in my pocket the day I needed to do this. What we're doing, in fact, is running this through LaTeX and into PDF by devious means, and this is an approach that has its problems. Say more about that, as I say, a little bit later on. Now, if I can figure out where I'm alt-tabbing to. Okay. Obviously, as you see, this provides an opportunity for some quality control. It shouldn't be the only control over submissions, right? I mean, yes, this does have the function of allowing a reviewer to limit or discard frivolous submissions, but that probably shouldn't be the way, you know, that you're actually controlling who's putting stuff in this thing. On the other hand, we decided very early on, and this is sort of anticipatory because I know somebody will ask, that we really couldn't build a lot of mechanisms into this that were used to control who can and cannot put stuff in. That's really done at the web server level. The reason is a practical one. There are so many reasons and so many ways that you might want to control who could submit to something like this that we really felt it best if individual sites thought through policy. I mean, you might have a set of submissions that are linked to something like a degree program. Okay. If you want to get your PhD, put your thesis in LEDA. Well, there needs to be a set of administrative controls around that we can't anticipate. Similarly, questions about who's allowed to submit or not, things that we could anticipate and control here. So basically, we sort of threw our hands in the air and said, well, there's an Apache server there. They can put security around the submissions process and password it and authorize people to use it in any way that they care to. So it really is a matter for some thinking about site policy before you embark on this thing, because it's something that we really can't take on behalf of others. Once the junk is in there, it becomes locally and globally searchable on the same metadata fields that you just saw put in. I'm going to do a search here on masters, only because I want you to notice that at the moment we're searching a LEDA site ostensibly at Cornell. In fact, it gets referred back to a global server that knows about a bunch of LEDA servers. And if we have any luck, it will start turning up a bunch of stuff that Elmer has put on his LEDA server in Emory. So all of this was submitted through the Emory server. And we'll say more about how all that works in a moment. Searching is limited to those bibliographic fields that you just saw. I can run back and show them to you, but it's the sort of stuff that you would normally expect to search serials for: author, title, subject, dates. Stop already. Go back, will you? I guess I won't show you that immediately because I don't feel like waiting for it. Global full text is coming real soon. It's actually not hard to do. It's mostly a matter of writing a little routine that dumps the catalog into a linked catalog that's something like Alkaline or Swishy or a global crawling type search engine can find. That, by the way, is a real advantage. As we look at some other things that people are doing out there, like SSRN, SSRN is kind of a ghetto. Law faculty are putting stuff in it. They like it because other law faculty see it. Nobody else does. So that in the case of an author at Cornell who is writing on death penalty stuff, his download rates off our working paper site at this point are literally 800 times what they are from SSRN. Faculty believe that this is great exposure. In fact, if they're doing interdisciplinary stuff or stuff that's of interest to the public, it's really not compared to what they can do by making themselves more generally accessible. But we can talk about that political issue later. Okay, tech stuff. What's here? Well, what's here is a bad diagram done with flowcharting software. We have all sorts of little ovals here that are basically PHP things. The submission interface that you saw, the reviewer interface that you saw, the site search interface you saw, that's all PHP. Looking at a MySQL database, holding the metadata, and looking at a document store that is in effect just a file system that the metadata database knows, where the document is. That's really all there is to it. There's a document conversion step here as the thing is coming in. The RTF conversion is done with good old off-the-shelf RTF to HTML, licensing fee $20. The PDF conversion, as I said a minute ago, is done by running RTF through LaTeX and then on into PDF with specialized tools and some intermediate filters in there that try to fix the things that those conversions do badly. And there's this mysterious looking thing over here called OAI publishing and OAI harvesting. And this is where we need to start talking about how these guys talk to one another, or more accurately, make themselves available to other sorts of services that want to come along and make use of the metadata. But basically, this is what you've got. You've got a MySQL database, a file system, and some PHP stuff. Because you've got a MySQL database sitting there, all sorts of stuff gets much easier to do. You could, for example, do exports of these records into whatever your local LPAC system is quite easily. Very simple Perl programming. If you've got a decent database programmer around, you can easily do that stuff. Nobody's done it yet. Hope somebody will. Faculty bibliography is always a wonderfully cursed issue. Gets somewhat easier to do if they're dumping this stuff in there. Journal publishing, I'm a little less sanguine about that, but it's what everybody seems to want. It has some problems. Institutionally branded collections. I think this is going to be a very strong selling point for this thing with deans. I mean, years ago, we gave up the idea that any journal is representative of the work of any particular school, and yet deans spend thousands of dollars shoving those glossy things in my mailbox that say recent scholarship from the law school at East Jesus. You know, so institutionally branded collections, I think, are going to be a very, very powerful thing and a very, very attractive thing in the mind of those who want to promote institutional reputation. They're not able to do that now. Side benefits and freebies of interest primarily to the technical community that you get from running one of these things. You get unique document identifiers. Everything that's in here basically has a unique document address done according to the OCLC handle system. So that you know you've got a unique and permanent document address for these things. I have to admit that there is uniqueness is guaranteed within a uniqueness is guaranteed, period, because naming authorities vary from site to site. You get Dublin core metadata. I mean, that's basically what we just collected in all those forms that you saw. We have not yet written the thing that folds it back into the HTML document itself once it's collected into the database. That's a trivial project that Brian will do between 7 and 9 on Tuesday next week. We're televising the event. You get abstracts, which you don't currently have because you're not currently collecting them. You get keywording and subject classification, and you get XML metadata. And this is where we start to talk a little bit about OAI. I think I'll show you what that looks like and then see if we can tab back and forth a little bit. What I've just done here is thrown the same kind of request at one of the Cornell servers that a so-called OAI harvester would throw. And what I've gotten back from my trouble is a little bit hard to read. Let's fold it up because I think that actually makes it somewhat easier. We sent it a list records request. We got back a list records element that contains a whole lot of record elements, each of which contains a header element that has an identifier and a date stamp, and some metadata according to a DC scheme. This is all stuff that ought to look pretty familiar. Title, creator, subject, description, identifier, publisher, blah, 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 blah. Basically what we have in the database on this document expressed in DC terms, in Dublin core terms, as XML. What exactly is this the basis for? Well, to understand why that happens and why we want that to happen, we need to know a little bit about OAI. There have been several attempts over the years to do digital library federation, where the idea was that you ran repositories in various locations and then tried somehow to federate them together into one big virtual collection that everybody should search. One of the earliest examples, and one that for all I know some of you encountered in school, was the ancestral project that a lot of computer science departments did for publishing technical papers. Repositories of these were run at various institutions. They used a rather slow and somewhat ugly but technically fascinating peer-to-peer protocol called Dienst, for having these servers talk to one another, and basically you could searching any ancestral server, searched all of them. You could unreliably turn up results across huge distributed collections of bibliographic data. We played around with Dienst for a while, and it was fun. It was a torrid affair, but brief, because the thing really did just break a lot. We've gone on to its successor, which is the so-called OAI protocol done by the folks at the Open Archives Initiative. Essentially what this thing is a protocol that says, okay, here are some verbs that you can feed in as parameters through a CGI script, and some other things that go with those verbs to sort of further define their meaning. And here are some well-formed XML responses that we expect you to get if you're being handed those verbs. So in effect, what it is a specification for writing a CGI script that takes a known set of parameters in on one side, or types of parameters, and spits out XML on the other. So what I was just showing you on the screen, if I can find it again, is in fact a well-formed OAI response to a list records request. You can see that we have up here these two parameters, verb equals list records and metadata prefix equals DC, which says, yes, I'd like you to list all your records, and I'd like that in Dublin Core format, please. Under the OAI spec, actually this XML can be anything you want, provided there's a schema somewhere that defines it. You can see it's carrying schema information right along with it. That's the stuff in red up there. That says, okay, this is the system by which we're defining these tags. Here are some tags. Dublin Core is expected on every OAI compliant server. You can do whatever additional sorts of schemas you want. So if at some point we wanted to develop one that was topic specific for law, we could do so. Right now I'm not seeing much use in it, but perhaps eventually it will. Dublin Core, as I say, is the common framework. Discipline-specific schemas are supported. And more to the point, what you're actually seeing described here by this mechanism is a kind of relationship that exists between people who have stuff, papers, data about those papers, and people who want to offer services based on that metadata, with the two disjoint. I'm a repository. I got a bunch of papers and a bunch of metadata, and I'm sitting here waiting for somebody to come along and hit my CGI script and ask for my XML. Across the room from me is Bernie, who's operating a so-called service provider, who's going to hit me, get some metadata, hit Elmer's site, hit Ken's site, aggregate that into his own database or do whatever he wants to with it, and in turn offer services based on his aggregation of the metadata. Those services might be cross-site searching between all the sites he's harvesting. They might be current awareness services offered across all the sites he's harvesting. It might be something as simple as authority control validation across all the sites that he's harvesting. Right? He might be looking at all those author records and saying, hey, all you guys got John Smiths, they the same one? So there's this disjuncture between people who are repositories for data and people who are, on the other hand, harvesting metadata and offering value-added services. Now, as it happens, in the LEDA software distribution, we bundle both. But I think what we're thinking this week is that nationally there would be an awful lot of people running repositories, one per law school. A very few people running service providers that are harvesting those law schools, 5 or 6. With no real, with some notion that those would be in some network sense regional, so that you have ability to get to those service providers with low latency for things like global searching and that sort of thing. Is this clear? I see a lot of puzzled looks. I'm taking silence as consent, folks. I have no choice. So. I just talked about some of these, right? What can you do if you're collecting everybody else's metadata? Well, you can do cross-site search, you can do current awareness services, you can do faculty bibliographies, you can do subject-specific current awareness. Here's everything in environmental law. You can do pathfinders, anything basically that you can do by sucking up that metadata into one place and kind of repackaging and redistributing it. You can do quite a lot. Okay, next question. Can you play too? Sure. We offer a free test drive site that basically just runs the submission and review systems that you can play with. You can upload stuff into it. You can see what you did when you did, just to get some idea for what it's like. It's also handy if you're going to Mr. Dean or Mr. Library Director and saying, geez, I'd like to play with one of these. Doesn't it look cool? We'll be down that day. You need any old Intel box that'll run Red Hat 7.1, so go down to Staples, spend $500, buy the CD of Red Hat 7.1, and you need installation instructions and an RPM from us. You can get one of these up and running on any old piece of junk you got laying around for the cost of installing Red Hat on it, downloading some stuff from us. And it takes about, I just did a cold installation up at Harvard. I sort of know what I'm doing. It took me a couple hours. I would allow a half a day. Ben and Ken, well, Ken, we don't count you.
In the special case, things. It took a while. It took us a day.
Did it?
It took me about a half day. Not counting, like I was one of those people who messed around with Dean's.
Yeah, well, and he's still not recovered from the experience.
There's some great instructions at the beginning that say, please don't try to just upgrade the old box. You really should follow those.
Yeah.
Guess that's good practice. It took me about 3/4 of a day the first time and about 3 hours the sixth time.
3 years.
Raising the following question. How good is it really? Well, I'll tell you. Document conversion is, as you would expect, technically quite fragile. The RTF to HTML conversions at this point are good except for charts, graphs, diagrams, and equations, largely because, as we all know from bitter experience, Windows Metafile is such a lot of fun to try to convert to anything. Fortunately, that's an exclusively technical solution, and we have somebody pretty clever working on it. So I'm pretty sanguine that that's going to get solved in a good way. PDF conversion is a lot more problematic, mainly because we're going through 2 stages and it's starting to feel more and more like a war of attrition to me. There are problems with going from RTF to LaTeX. For example, LaTeX surfaces all of the hidden document comments in the RTF, or at least the converter that we have does. There are problems in going from LaTeX to PDF that have to do with footnote numbering. Actually, that's a problem that sort of exists across all 3 stages. The bottom line is that we're in one of these games where, you write a little filter to clean up the RTF so that what gets fed to the LaTeX won't produce something horrendous. And then you get something to clean up the LaTeX so that what gets fed to the PDF converter won't do anything horrendous. And each of these are things that have to be tweaked and adjusted and fooled with and so forth and so on. That may be a game we can eventually win, but we are looking around for some other way to do this because it's starting to feel like a losing game. I'm not sure that ultimately it is, but it's starting to feel that way. Assuming all that gets solved, and I have every reason to think that it will within the next couple of months, you know and I know that no matter what you do, 5% of the documents that get handed to you inevitably will not convert cleanly. Because you've got some guy out there who just believes that legal scholarship is going to suffer unless his footnotes are in Urdu Sanskrit 11 point. Right? And it's very hard to build systems to deal with that. I think that's going to be a continuing problem. It's a problem that scales down the more of us are working on it because we can obviously start picking up each other's solutions. And in fact, it does fall off pretty quickly. We went through this with special characters. At first, they were very problematic. What kind of a curly quote is that we just got handed? And which character set is that in again? But in fact, you get a pretty good base of documents out there and you can find and fix a lot of those problems very, very, very quickly. Again, it comes with experience, and collective experience is always good because we just get to look at a much bigger base of documents much quicker. It's, in a sense, bibliographically fragile, right? I mean, I'm sure there are 14 librarians sitting in this room right now saying, well, but what about the subject taxonomy? And how do we guarantee that people aren't going to do this and do that or commit this other sin against, AACR and blah, 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 blah? And you're all absolutely right. There's a lot of this that can't be specified by a software developer or even a software developer who's being informed by librarians. There's a lot of this that boils down to determining what standards and practices ought to be for interacting with this system and for the data that goes into it and so forth and so on. And that is going to be the product of a lot of discussion in the community. It's not going to get dictated on high. It's not going to be enforced through the software. It's stuff that people are going to have to hash out in the interest of having each of their collections operating in roughly similar ways. Sounds a lot like bibliography, doesn't it? It's socially fragile in the sense that a consumer culture cannot make this work. It is not enough. It's not going to be enough to say, well, yeah, I'll use it when it's done. Because it isn't going to get done unless a fair number of people work on it. I mean, that's just really the case. It's not going to be enough that everybody sits there and say, well, sure, Tom, drop us some email when you're finished with it. Because it will take a long time to finish it, working with the resources I currently have without a lot of help. And some people thus far have been extremely helpful. Finally, I guess I would sum it up by saying all of this sounds pretty abstract, and it is. It's a framework within which you can build certain kinds of repositories that offer solutions to problems that you have, the faculty who are knocking on your door saying, put my stuff up, in ways that help to make it locatable and so forth and so on. But that's not really a very concrete notion until some people are actually out there working with it and shaping it and getting it to do things that are in some way helpful to people. So you can all take notes. Here's where everything I just said is, in some slightly terser forms, if you want to look that up. And I'm happy to say that we got about 20 minutes left for questions, suggestions, offers of help, puzzlements. I know I blasted through that very, very quickly. Please ask away. Yeah, Mo.
Have you considered the standard schema of DTD for the document itself, just like you have the metadata?
I've thought of. Yeah, I've thought about that set of issues, and I've decided that for basically the same reason that I try not to drink coffee after about 6 o'clock at night, I don't really want to think about them until we start seeing word processors that can put XML out the back end. Which is to say, it's a great idea and we ought to do it, but until it's something that some author can do by pressing a save as choice, I'm not sure I want to go there, because there are so many issues involved. I think you're right that it's ultimately the solution, but we need word processors doing XML first, I think. I wouldn't even be totally sanguine about that. There's some vastly different document types in there that range from scholarly articles to op-ed pieces to LLM theses to you name it. And the idea that those would be able to operate with a standard DTD that was anything but structural in nature, that's hard. That you could do much more than sectioning and structiving. But maybe, they could mark up the metadata elements. It's a good idea. It's just going to be fiendishly difficult to work out. Yeah, Bernie?
If you build a toggle, they come. How do you get faculty to buy into this? You said, you can only show it to Dean, but...
Exposure, I think, is the issue. The problem we've got with this stuff in general right now, and I'm sure you've encountered it yourself, is that faculty are really understanding the world of electronic publication of their stuff, it seems to me, as consisting of a world of strict alternatives, and it doesn't, right? I mean, they look at you and they say, well, if I put it in LEDA, can I put it in SSRN? Because I think you really can't. And one of the reasons that we sort of pitched this at a level that said, well, have your secretary do it, have your research assistant do it, is that we, A, want to convince them that it's not a strict alternative, that they can do this as well, and that the marginal cost of doing so is very low. I mean, that's the response to the person who doesn't want it because they think it might be some work. It ain't much work. How do you promote the idea? The same way you do anything, exposure and archival value. It'll be where people can see it, and it will be there approximately forever in a locatable way. Your stuff will be found.
I think I already know. Are you pointing at me? Or
Yes, I am. Deanna, speak up.
I think I sort of know, but about how many sites are up and running now, one. Two, do you have any sense of about how many documents are already in there and how scalable it's going to be in terms of distributed search and speed? That's 3 questions.
Yeah. Well, you know how many documents Harvard has. I don't offhand.
About a couple hundred and probably another 75 in the next few weeks.
So coming up on 300. Emory is up and has a few that Elmer has put in. Cornell has about 50. Tulsa has a few. Again, a demo site. Duke has a few.
Very few.
Very few. So we've got 5, 6 sites running if you count the 2 Cornell ones, because we have a development site as well as one that's actually holding formal papers, and a grand collection of around 350 papers. Scalability, too soon to tell, but given the harvesting mechanism, I actually think that's a question of how big can you scale one MySQL database, and the answer is pretty damn big. I mean, on the order of hundreds of thousands of records. So I don't think we really need to worry about that just yet. Sooner or later, we may get into scalability questions on the centralized stuff, but then there are ways of dealing with that through standard sort of database technology. Yeah.
How does the PHP communicate with the MySQL? And the reason I ask that is it possible to substitute like a Microsoft SQL Server or some other ODBC database for the MySQL?
I'll point in Brian's direction only because I know he went down the abstraction road at one point and didn't quite go there, but I don't know how hard it would be to retrace the steps on that block.
Well, I started out thinking that this should be possible. And then for various reasons decided to stop worrying about it. But there seems to be a lot of the database querying simply for handling errors and stuff is wrapped in functions. That would be doable. Although that assumes that it assumes that you could do everything with every database. So if you're using a fancy, if you're using Oracle, obviously you can do more, and the little queries. The way I've been talking to MySQL is no longer adequate. So that's a question. If MySQL and MS Access can do all
MySQL server, yeah,
can do the same thing, it's feasible, and it's not.
The queries themselves are pretty vanilla, are they not?
Yeah. Although it might be interesting to note that having done a lot of stuff with open source database, typically when I see open source PHP stuff that deals with databases, that deal with multiple databases, your choices tend to be MySQL, Postgres, and Oracle. I've rarely seen an open source database thing that's either going to do, I've never seen one that says it'll handle MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server directly. Some that say they'll deal with ODBC. So I don't know. I mean, I've never looked at it, so I don't know what why that is. That's
well, while we're in that universe, I'll say too that one thing I would love to see somebody do is a Win2K port. This is running.
I'm talking to somebody about that right now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, David Dickens. So, sorry.
There you have it.
Actually, I think a lot of that would depend on what kind of database that built with PHP.
PHP has fantastic.
Yeah, I know. So it has a lot of capabilities. So I would imagine that. I mean, if you built HP with IDBC or something like that,
Yeah, you probably
could go down that alley.
And here's Ben.
No, just before we scare off every non-tech person, really, this is not important. I mean, it's important to a tiny percentage of us, but really, if you all will go to testdrive.log/LEDA and practice submitting something so you can tell the people involved what is crappy about the interface. Because in my conversations with the librarians, they immediately picked up on some things. I don't mean that those are, at least from my more non-librarian perspective, valid, but they picked up on some things that were interesting.
Sure.
Right away. And you can go to that site and try out some submissions, try out the review cycle, and give that feedback to people without installing any of this or getting focused on the PHP, Perl, whatever it is, secret stuff we do.
And actually, in the install process is very well documented, and you know, since it doesn't take a monster machine to run on it. Ours is running on a P333 with 512 meg of RAM, just an old, something I stuck more memory in. It doesn't take much to get going, and it doesn't even take any real knowledge of Linux. As long as you're comfortable with working with computers, you can get it up and running. And then after that, the whole thing's just web interface. The new versions of Red Hat lock themselves down very well.
Yeah.
So you don't even have to worry a lot about.
That's worth mentioning. One of the reasons we moved very quickly to put 7.1 behind this is that it really does save you from yourself. If you're not an experienced system administrator, everything's sort of off by default. That hand's been up for a while.
To follow up on that, can I use your server instead of doing it locally?
There are a lot of reasons why I'd love. There are a lot of reasons I'd love to say yes. But I don't think $600 is a lot to ask. Seriously, one of the things that scares me to death is that there are good reasons to have these collections locally owned and operated. I would be happy to host for you on a separate box, but I'm very, very leery to be quite cynical about the tendency that law schools have to cry poverty in the face of something like this.
I think it gives the school a lot more ownership of the materials too.
Yes.
To have to host it.
Yes, so on the one hand, I want to be a nice guy and say, hey, let's all play. On the other hand, I sort of think, well, you got to believe, and you got to believe to the tune of being willing to run your own box.
The second question would be, is this a supplement or an additional publishing format? And I hate to use the word commercial, but in addition to where faculty may commercially publish something?
Sure.
So it's up to the author to obtain the permissions.
Yeah, the author generally has them, more often than they believe that they do. And I'm imagining that there are about 6 people in this room who know far more than I do about those issues. I think I see one up there.
Actually, I have more of a librarian question, Tom. Will the reviewer have a mechanism to reject a submission with lack of metadata or lack of complete metadata? And if not, does that not undercut any searching that can run in the metadata system?
Oh, yeah, of course they will. I mean, that's why we gave them a quality control step so they could control quality. But yeah.
So you send it back to the submitter and say, try again.
I'm not sure that it's clear what happens at this point if you decide if you decide you don't like their face. Short of just not accepting it. My assumption is that you wouldn't accept it. That you would then email back to them and say, I don't like your face, and they would respond to that however they respond to it. Things that are blatantly incomplete get caught during the submission phase. I mean, we do have some validation operating there, so if something comes back and if there's no abstract, it says, hey! But, so horrendously incomplete stuff gets caught. But we've been there's an interesting game you play with that, as you know yourself from doing e-commerce stuff, between sort of getting complete information on the one hand and sort of irritating the customer on the other by continuing to beat them over the head for stuff that they haven't filled out because they didn't know it. It's interesting to try to anticipate what's going to happen there. Yeah. You've been trying for a while. I'm sorry. I'll get to you. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. I think you're going through a lot of trouble to produce PDF versions of the documents. What's the benefit?
Well, depends on who you ask. I think in a sort of abstract way that we need to be a workable basis for a print-on-demand system. I mean, that's really the bottom line. I could care less about PDF personally. Terry cares about PDF. Citability, yeah. What you need for citability is pagination, and certainly PDF has that. But you could do the same thing with star pagination in the HTML version or something similar to star pagination. So that's another argument, but I would say that there is a sort of a print-on-demand function that's useful to support. I'm going there because you've been waiting so long.
Well, because I've got the really basic question. So I've heard that Harvard has loaded up some documents. Where do I go to find them, and how do I know that Harvard has loaded up some documents, except sitting here?
Interesting question.
You could just go to our site and search or browse. I mean, I can give you a hint, a lot of them are
Well,
about
I mean, just from the abstract point of view, how will people know to go look for LEDA? What is?
How do they know to go look at ESPN?
No, if I set up a server, how does she know that I even have a server?
Because you announce it on Tech Noise.
Well, that's
Actually doesn't need to know, but she knows that Tom's got LEDA, and he searches all the LEDA sites, so as they get added.
Yeah.
I have to know to go to one of these maybe 5 places.
Yeah.
To be able to search everything. Okay.
Or no, you can actually do that from any site. You can actually do that from any site.
No, I don't understand that. I can do that from any. No, I don't have.
Any operating LEDA site, yes.
Okay, I can do it from any operating LEDA site.
Yes.
Okay, so I have to know where those LEDA sites are.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
But you have a choice of searching this site or that site.
Okay. Okay.
Correct?
Correct.
We have other LEDA. And at some point we might do email off of the
We might. Some service provider might opt to offer a current awareness service. Honestly, to tell you the truth, it would be painfully easy to do. I've stayed away from it because my feeling is that with everybody being spammed by SSRN already, why would I live in that bad neighborhood? Yeah.
RTF is the only way in. You can't bring HTML straight in?
Yes, you can. If you want to do your own converted stuff. Yes. It insists on RTF. You can put in additional formats if you want.
So if you have something that's native HTML, you can't put it in.
That's right.
Bring it into something
Yeah, something ugly like RTF. A line had to be drawn somewhere. Who else? Yeah.
If a certain document doesn't convert to PDF, is there any way to just have that one in HTML, or is it sort of, it's got to be there in both formats or nothing?
Well, we don't insist on that. The mechanism that we're looking at building right now is one by which users who have submitted stuff can do direct replacement of any file that they've submitted. There's a couple of reasons to do that. One is if the conversions work badly. Another is if you've gotten something that's, say, a journal article at a nascent stage where pagination isn't final, and they come up with a final PDF version that does reflect the actual pagination and layout, you want them able to replace the one they had with that. Now, I know that's going to start a war, okay? We offer direct replacement only as, we intend to offer direct replacement only as direct replacement. They'll see a list of files similar to the one that they saw when they were submitting and were invited to put them in order and say, okay, if you want to put one in place of this one, please do. They will not be offered the opportunity to restructure it, add additional stuff, this, that, or the other. This, on the one hand, gives the author or the originator a certain amount of freedom to replace stuff like bad conversions. All the bibliographers here will be sitting there saying it also gives the freedom to totally screw up versioning and the uniqueness of the handles, and I'm afraid that's a compromise we're going to have to make. Sooner or later, you do have to trust them to act somewhat responsibly. And you put signs all over it that says, please, if you've done anything, if you've changed anything more than a space bar hit here, do not put a new original in. But ultimately, you have to let them do it, I think. You have to give them some kind of access there. Sites may vary on that. This may be a matter of local policy. If you want to be, completely in control of this and say no, every new version is a new handle, is a new document, you can do that. Yeah.
Any interest or contact with other than legal disciplines?
Well, this is a nice thing that I guess I didn't go into. OAI is a standard that is certainly not limited to the legal world. In fact, it's coming out of the scientific community. So that the Federation is not only operating at the level across law schools, it could certainly operate institutionally, it could operate with other sub-disciplines as well. So if the economists suddenly decide that they want to start harvesting all the law and economics stuff, they can certainly do that. I mean, OAI at this point is prevalent in the physics and chemistry communities. They're the ones doing it, and I expect that it will evolve into the standard that universities are using to aggregate this kind of stuff as well. So you've got cross-disciplinarity, you've got the possibility of federation within a campus or a university system or a regional consortium, really however you want to do it. And it will be as, sort of recombinant as OAI becomes widespread. I haven't been taking questions from over on this side of the room. No, nobody has any, that's why. Anybody else? Yeah.
How am I going to ask you? What's your ultimate vision for
Geez, a fat IPO and smoking cigars, driving Mercedes.
Give options at every new boss that agrees to set up.
I would like to see one of these things operating in every law school in the United States and beyond. I would like to see 5 or 6 or 7 large regional aggregators or SPs operating global services. I would like to see them operating as a relatively permanent archive for digital scholarship, and I would like to start to explore what happens when we start putting them in some other interesting places. I think something like this offers an opportunity, this sort of goes to Rick's question too, of bridging some long-felt gaps between what the bench and the bar do and what the academics do on the other. It'd be interesting to drop a couple of these on somebody like the Wisconsin State Bar Association or the American Association of Corporate Counsel, who are actually publishing relatively interesting stuff on websites now, and seeing what happens when that stuff gets federated in with quote-unquote serious scholarly literature. I mean, the academics may well turn up their noses at it, but I suspect it serves a very practical purpose that, again, the bench and bar have been bitching about for years. So there's no reason to stop at law schools. I'd be happy if I had 15 of these things running full bore by the end of the calendar year, twice that many the next year, and a consortium the year after that. We started out, Terry Martin, who runs that big used bookstore over on the other side of the river there, started out paying for this thing. Cornell is now paying for it for the ongoing development. I'd like to form at least a few people around it so we could pay Brian. He'll be in front with a hat at the end of the hour. But no, but seriously, I mean, I'd like to see a consortium form around it, and I'd like to see it go forward in a reasonable and extensive way. We've got the beginnings of something here. We obviously ain't got the whole thing, and it's going to take a lot of effort to get it where it needs to go, but I think where it needs to go is across every law school we can possibly put it in. It's a network effect thing, right? I mean, the more of them there are, the more fun we get to have. Others? You say can't be like, yeah.
I didn't understand your point about the working paper handling on SSI versus RSP.
Oh, versus LEDA? Yeah. SSRN is a well, they do some kind of dumb things, actually, but as a collection, they are not open to external search engines like Google or Yahoo, so that if you've got something on the death penalty, let us say, sitting in SSRN, and you do a Google search on the phrase death penalty, you will not find it. That means that it's pretty much a community that is limited to those who, like your question, know to look there, which is basically legal scholars. Now, on the assumption that you got some people who are writing stuff for people other than the 5 people who read their last article in the East Jesus Law Review, they probably want better exposure than that. And the way to gain that exposure at the moment is really through search engines for interdisciplinary purposes. Yes, people within the legal scholarly community know to look in this or that piece of SSRN. Nobody else does. That's the fundamental problem. And as I say, in the case of some of our people who are writing not only strongly interdisciplinary stuff, but stuff of great public interest, the difference in the download rates is literally on 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. Yeah?
We're finding just the opposite. In fact, the faculty don't want to have articles out there because they're getting, that's what if they do a death penalty, they're suddenly getting lots of emails and then, sort of literally almost threatening emails saying, USOB, why didn't you respond to me? I've got this case, and that SSRN actually gives them an insulation that they prefer. I mean, most of these people are well-meaning, but they've also attracted the nuts. And I wonder, what you wrote, and that's what some of my faculty are clearly afraid of.
2 words: scholarly communication.
Well, but their email boxes are being loaded. There's also, I don't know how you email filters.
And also, you don't gather the author's email address doesn't turn up as, an article. Now, of course, you go and search it up. Right.
Actually, in fact, I was about to say for entirely other reasons that one of the dumber things that SSRN has done is tightly bind author metadata to particular documents. I've sort of felt like calling them up and saying, well, you published this piece of Bernie Black's. How do you know his office phone isn't going to change? Because they really do put all that contact information in there, and I'm unsure of the wisdom of that. Although, again, we went through this with publicly listing office phone numbers on websites. They were, convinced that their privacy was going to be trashed by this, and in the long run, hasn't really proven to be a problem.
And there's also the possibility of using this strictly on a local basis, right? I think there's a ton of value. I've been around long enough to know that every faculty, for every paper that a faculty member's had published, they've got 3 or 4 more sitting in WordPerfect 5.1 for DOS files, someplace moldering away. That I think that there's a responsibility on some level for somebody to be archiving that stuff, because it is work. It is what they've been doing and what they've been working on, and without passing any value judgment on how good scholarship it is, this provides a way to archive that information. And you could very easily set this up and just tell Tom that we don't want to talk to anybody.
Yeah, you can. Yeah,
and
and
so
you can
it's only available from inside of your building.
shut your harvesting interface off. Yeah.
Here's looking at this more also in the context of law reviews. First of all, potentially this would be first publication.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, is there a way to fit into some additional certification function along with the reviewer function, such that East Jesus Constitutional Law Review goes in every month, looks at all the common law articles and says, well, these are the ones we want to certify as being part of the standard?
Well, yes, it's actually called a web page. You've got your choice of mechanisms here, okay? You can either take the position that we exercise selectivity by not putting the stuff in the bucket in the first place, right? Or you can exercise a function of selectivity by saying, we will build a web page that says, here's all the good stuff, and only point to certain things that are in the bucket. So if you want to do something like peer review, or really build any other kinds of structures you might think of, but peer review is a good one to start with, my suggestion would be that, in fact, you do that as an external page that points into the bucket.
But wouldn't it be nice to have that as part of this whole structure, such that one of the pieces of metadata attached to the article itself was that?
Well, yeah, we have that. We have series titling in it. So, in effect, you invent a series called Good Stuff, right? Or the East Jesus Law Review, and it's part of that. It's part of that. Yes?
I have a question about the word archive as well as yours forever.
I thought someone might.
Do you have a plan for managing that? Are you going to refresh the data every once in a while to go out with no recorder, or what's the plan for doing that?
There isn't one yet. Obviously, it's a difficult issue that will get significantly easier at the point where we can start putting this stuff in XML or some other relatively plain vanilla format that has some longevity to it. My feeling is that like most questions, that's a bridge we probably can't burn for a couple of years yet, but ultimately we need to burn it. Various places are doing things. Terry could talk about Harvard's central scheme for archiving digital objects in a way in which format up conversion is guaranteed until the end of time. You might want to think about doing something like that, but we've been a little busy to give it much thought. It does need thinking about, just as it needs thinking about for all kinds of digital holdings that people have. I will say this, though. Before we get too excited about this sort of not being able to do that, there are a lot of things about LEDA that I look at and say, well, yeah, you're right, it doesn't do that, but God damn it, at least we've got it all in one place. At the point where we do decide to do it. And that's non-trivial. That's non-trivial. Yeah, Terry.
I don't expect be running the archive that I want to use. I'm going to be putting it all someplace else. People whose business does that. But as Tom said, it's collected now in a standard format. We've got the metadata. It doesn't require any staff to do it. At some point we might just trust the whole process enough to turn off the reviewer function and let the whole thing run automatically. That's my opinion. But so the archive isn't there because I don't think people have really built these archives. It'll be a lot easier to use them when you've got a bunch of stuff that's pretty standard.
I mean, from another point of view, you could simply say, well, an archiving service is really just another service provider who's looking at all this stuff and sucking it into some high quality archive somewhere. I do think that it would be good once we start having some sort of community around this, if people would start thinking about taking on that function, if we could agree on some level of redundancy and all the issues. It is exactly the sort of thing that I was talking about when I said that this is an abstraction that needs to be made concrete in some ways. That's definitely one of the ways. More? Or are people... We're officially over by a few minutes, but let's do more. Mr. Haywood.
What about data backup?
Local responsibility.
Yeah, you know about the John, right?
Well, yeah. Is there going to be a standard, or are you going to say, to protect the data, should we have a standard?
Problem.
Everybody has to be running RAID. Fine. Or everybody has to have a tape backup or burn a CD or whatever.
Right. It's a standards and practices question, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, Ben.
Just real briefly, building on what Elmer said earlier about going through sort of the drawers of the faculty to find scholarship.
In what sense?
But I just wanted to remind people, remember we increasingly, I think almost every law school requires a third-year paper or some substantial work of scholarship, even from our non-law review students. Those papers are going nowhere. I mean, those papers are not accessible to anybody. And that's an issue that we're not stepping on faculty toes, we're not stepping on law journal editors' toes. We are perhaps making a student who didn't have an avenue for publication a little excited. We're giving them some connection to the school, and some of those papers actually do have valuable scholarship in them. And that's one of the things that I've been pushing at Tulsa, is this idea that we can capture some student output that otherwise would have been lost.
And it's not just student output. I mean, I invite everybody to think for a minute about where this sort of collective output of the cyber law community was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It sure wasn't appearing in the journals in any organized way. And the same was true of all the people who were doing feminist jurisprudence and that sort of thing. There are a lot of emerging literatures that don't have a place to go, that will start looking rather good aggregated in something like this. There are people doing seminar subjects out there that practitioners are desperate to have access to writing on. Or at least so Hut's FDA stuff has always been represented to me. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've been told. The world is beating down his door to get at that stuff. Right? Yeah.
Related to the backup question, if someone sets up a LEDA server, and then their IT staff quits, whatever goes down, they never look at it again, will other LEDA sites be forever generating dead links to the server that's not up? Or does
Sure.
I have some policy for compensating for that?
See,
Yes, you certainly may.
This gets to one of my favorite things. This should not be an IT guy's decision to run up one of these things, right?
Regardless, mistakes will happen. Sites will go down.
Sites will go down, and then we need to pull that. But
You need a revocation function, is essentially what you're saying, and I think that's right.
So the answer is OAI does not have any facility for ever filtering out material that's no longer available.
No, although we could.
Although, frankly, if I put up one of these and then I left and it got walled in for 4 years, the data that's on there is still valid. I mean, it's old now, but those articles are still there and it's still running, so why shouldn't it still be being collected? you know, at some point. I mean, you know how old it is, you can see when it was put in there, but, you know.
This actually goes to the question that he didn't ask or was asking and was gracious enough not to force me to answer, which has to do with needing not only a sort of revocation function but a suspension function. I mean, what we imagine here is something like a sports broadcast blackout, whereby if the Duke Law Journal comes by and says, "Well, you can't have that stinking article. We're publishing it," we say, "Fine. You know, we'll put the black spot next to it for 2 years or however long we agree that your first publication rights run for, and then we'll pull the black spot off. But no, we ain't not taking it." Right?
I would just like to respectfully submit that the day could come where my dean says, "Greg, this is a waste of time. We're not spending any more resources on it. Pull the plug on that baby." It could happen.
Sure. We hope that by the time that comes around, you know, he'd feel about that the same way he would about taking a match to the library stacks. But I agree it's a danger. We're done. Whoever wants to talk, I'm around. Okay? Thanks.